Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1908, Stone County, Missouri, remained scarred by memories of the Civil War that had ended just over 4 decades earlier. The rugged hills and deep hollows provided refuge for those seeking isolation from society, and among these remote settlements stood the Warren homestead, approximately 22 miles southwest of Galena, in a hollow known locally as Preacher's Gap. The Warren family consisted of Silas Warren, age 51, his wife Constance, age 46, and their 4 adult children: Nathaniel, 28, Abigail, 25, Jeremiah, 23, and Ruth, 20. They had arrived in the area in 1894, purchasing 160 acres of heavily wooded land featuring a natural spring that bubbled up from the limestone beneath. From the beginning, the Warrens maintained a reputation for reclusiveness, though this alone did not mark them as particularly unusual in a region where independence and privacy were valued traits. County records show they paid their taxes on time and caused no disturbances that would warrant official attention. Neighbors occasionally encountered them on the rough roads connecting scattered homesteads, and these meetings were marked by polite but minimal interaction. The family built their homestead methodically over the first few years, constructing not only a main house but also several outbuildings and, most notably, a stone structure they referred to as their chapel. This building, set back from the main house and partially obscured by oak trees, would later become central to understanding the true nature of the Warren family. For 14 years, they lived in Preacher's Gap, present but peripheral to community life, attending no churches, participating in no social gatherings, and maintaining boundaries that most neighbors respected out of custom and courtesy. The Ozarks had always been home to folks who preferred solitude, and the Warrens seemed merely another family seeking peace in the hills. No one suspected that within their isolated compound, practices were being conducted that would eventually horrify the entire region and leave questions that remain unanswered more than a century later. The Warren family's peculiar reputation developed gradually through small observations accumulated over years. County records and local newspapers, particularly the Galena Gazette and the Stone County Record, documented minimal interaction between the Warrens and the broader community from 1894 through 1908. Neighboring families, the Hendersons to the north, the Colemans to the east, and the Briggs family to the south, occasionally shared observations that, when examined collectively, painted a picture of increasingly unusual behavior. The Warrens conducted most of their activities at night, with smoke rising from their property at odd hours when most farming families would have been asleep. Several neighbors reported seeing what appeared to be religious ceremonies conducted in a grove of trees behind the main dwelling, with multiple figures moving in coordinated patterns by lamplight. Store ledgers from Galena merchants revealed curious purchasing patterns. The Warrens bought unusual quantities of salt, lime, candles, and various preserving materials, far exceeding what a family of 6 would typically require for normal food preservation. Notably absent from their purchases was any livestock feed, despite their substantial acreage that should have supported animals. When merchants inquired about this, Silas Warren explained that the family maintained a vegetarian diet for religious reasons and kept no animals beyond what wild game they hunted. Postmaster records indicated that the Warrens received regular correspondence from various locations in the eastern states, Massachusetts, and New York primarily, but never sent letters themselves. The postmaster, Henry Fulton, noted in his personal diary that the letters bore no return addresses and were sealed with black wax, an unusual practice that suggested secretive communication. Martha Henderson, whose property shared a boundary with the Warren land, recorded in her journal that on several occasions she heard voices from the Warren property raised in what she described as unnatural chant-like rhythms, always after midnight. William Coleman observed lantern lights moving through the Warren woods in organized patterns, suggesting multiple people engaged in coordinated activity rather than random movement. The family appeared at Galena only when necessary for supplies, always sending Silas or Nathaniel, never the women or younger son. When townspeople attempted friendly conversation, the Warren men responded with polite but minimal words, deflecting questions about their family's activities and expressing no interest in local affairs. These accumulated observations created an atmosphere of unease, though most residents attributed the family's strangeness to religious eccentricity rather than anything more sinister. On the 14th of March 1908, 19-year-old Samuel Briggs left his family's farm to check trap lines near the boundary between the Briggs property and the Warren homestead. When Samuel failed to return by nightfall, his father organized a search party with neighbors. They discovered Samuel's rifle and hat approximately 300 yards from the Warren property, abandoned beside a game trail with no signs of struggle. Sheriff Thomas McKinley arrived the following morning to conduct an official investigation. He questioned Silas Warren, who stated that he had heard a single gunshot earlier in the day but had seen nothing and assumed it was another neighbor hunting. The sheriff found this explanation plausible, as accidental shootings occurred with unfortunate regularity in the Ozarks, and young men sometimes wandered far from where they were last seen. The search party combed the area for 3 days, checking ravines where Samuel might have fallen, exploring cave systems where he might have sought shelter if injured, and following every possible path he might have taken. Despite their thorough efforts, no trace of Samuel Briggs beyond his rifle and hat was ever found. Sheriff McKinley's official report, preserved in county archives, concluded that the young man had likely suffered an accident in the rugged terrain, and that his body would eventually be discovered when the spring thaw revealed areas currently inaccessible. The Briggs family rejected this conclusion, convinced that something more sinister had occurred. Reverend Hosea Matthews, who ministered to several families in the area, recorded in his journal that the disappearance created increased tension throughout the community, with many privately wondering about the Warren family's possible involvement despite lack of evidence. The Briggs family's grief turned to frustration as weeks passed without resolution. Samuel's mother refused to believe her son had simply vanished, insisting that someone knew what had happened to him. Community members began whispering that the Warren property, so close to where Samuel's belongings were found, should be searched more thoroughly. But Sheriff McKinley explained that without probable cause, he could not violate the Warrens' property rights. The disappearance of Samuel Briggs marked the beginning of a series of events that would ultimately reveal the horrifying truth about the Warren family. For now, it remained an unsolved mystery, one tragic incident among many that occurred in the unforgiving wilderness of the Ozark Hills. Between April and July of 1908, multiple neighbors reported increasingly disturbing sounds emanating from the Warren property during nighttime hours. Martha Henderson provided sworn testimony to Sheriff McKinley, describing voices raised in unnatural chant, like rhythms that would continue for hours, always beginning well after midnight when honest folks were asleep. She stated that the sounds were unlike any church singing or prayer she had ever heard, carrying a quality that made her uneasy in ways she struggled to articulate. William Coleman's statement to the sheriff described observing lantern lights moving in organized patterns through the Warren woods, not the random movement of someone walking, but coordinated activity suggesting multiple people engaged in synchronized actions. He watched these lights on 3 separate occasions, each time between midnight and dawn, forming patterns that seemed to circle specific areas before converging near what he believed was the stone chapel the Warrens had built. The Warren property itself covered 160 acres of heavily wooded land with significant elevation changes, featuring the main house positioned on a relatively flat area near the natural spring. A large barn built partially into the hillside for natural insulation, several smaller outbuildings for storage, and most notably, the stone structure neighbors referred to as the chapel. This building, approximately 20 by 30 feet, had been constructed by the Warren family themselves using limestone quarried from their property. It featured no windows whatsoever, unusual for any structure in that era, and possessed a single reinforced door that was always kept locked. When neighbors had inquired about the building's purpose during its construction years earlier, Silas Warren explained it was for private family worship and storage of items too valuable to keep in the main house. The chapel's windowless design, he claimed, was intended to create a contemplative atmosphere free from external distractions. Several residents noted that the building seemed designed more like a fortress than a place of worship, with walls thicker than necessary, and that reinforced door suggesting it was built to keep something either in or out. The sounds, reported by neighbors, seemed to originate from the direction of this structure, though the distance and terrain made it impossible to be certain. Other residents reported their own observations during this period. The Hendricks family, whose children sometimes played in the woods near the property line, forbade them from approaching the Warren land after their youngest daughter reported seeing pale figures standing motionlessly among the trees at dusk, figures that vanished when she called out to them. On the 2nd of August 1908, circuit preacher Amos Reed decided to visit the Warren homestead despite warnings from concerned community members. Reed, a dedicated minister who believed strongly in reaching isolated families, had become increasingly troubled by the Warrens' complete absence from any religious gatherings and the disturbing rumors circulating about them. In his final letter to his wife, preserved in county archives, Reed wrote that there was something profoundly unsettled about the Warren family, and that he felt compelled by Christian duty to reach them, though he confessed a reluctance he could not rationally explain. He departed on horseback early that morning, telling several people he expected to return by evening. When Reed failed to arrive home that night, his wife alerted Sheriff McKinley the following morning. 3 days later, Reed's horse was discovered near the Warren property line, still saddled with the preacher's Bible in the saddlebag, but no sign of Reed himself. Sheriff McKinley conducted a more thorough investigation this time, bringing deputies and searching not only the area where the horse was found, but also visiting the Warren property to question the family. Silas Warren stated calmly that Preacher Reed had indeed visited, that they had spoken briefly about religious matters, and that Reed had departed after perhaps an hour, heading east, toward the next settlement on his circuit. When McKinley asked why Reed would leave his horse behind, Silas suggested the animal might have wandered back after Reed continued on foot, though this explanation satisfied no one. The sheriff searched the immediate area around where the horse was found, but discovered no evidence of violence or struggle. With no witnesses to contradict the Warrens' account and no body to prove a crime had occurred, McKinley was once again stymied by lack of evidence. The community reaction to Reed's disappearance was more intense than the response to Samuel Briggs vanishing 5 months earlier. Reed was a respected figure, a man of God, and his disappearance so close to the Warren property, coming after he had specifically gone to confront them about their isolation, seemed too coincidental to dismiss. At a community meeting, angry voices called for action against the Warren family, but cooler heads prevailed, pointing out that suspicion was not evidence, and that American law required proof before accusations could be made. Still, the Warren family found themselves increasingly isolated, with neighbors who had previously maintained polite distance now actively avoiding them and regarding them with open hostility. The disappearance of Amos Reed marked a turning point in community sentiment toward the Warrens, transforming vague unease into active suspicion. Sheriff Thomas McKinley's personal journal, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1957, reveals that his concerns about the Warren family extended far beyond what he included in official reports. His private entries describe observations during multiple visits to their property that deeply troubled him. He noted the unusual coldness of the main house even during summer months, a chill that seemed to emanate from the structure itself rather than from any natural source. McKinley observed the complete absence of typical farm animals. No chickens scratching in the yard, no pigs rooting near the barn, no cattle in the fields, which struck him as extraordinarily odd for a family claiming to be self-sufficient. Most disturbing to the sheriff was the behavior of the Warren family members themselves. Constance Warren rarely spoke, maintaining a vacant expression that McKinley described as looking through people rather than at them. The 4 adult children exhibited synchronized movements, often turning their heads in unison or standing motionless for extended periods without apparent purpose. When McKinley asked direct questions, Silas would answer while the others remained silent, watching with expressions the sheriff characterized as expectant, as though waiting for something specific to happen. McKinley's journal entries about the stone chapel reveal his deepest suspicions. He wrote that the structure was sealed with a lock, unlike any he had encountered, far more complex than necessary for a simple chapel, and that when he inquired about its purpose, Silas claimed it was for private worship and storage of family heirlooms too precious to risk theft. The door was reinforced with iron bands that seemed excessive for its stated purpose, and McKinley noted that the mortar between stones appeared fresh in places despite the family's claim the building had been constructed years earlier, suggesting ongoing modifications. In one particularly revealing entry, McKinley admitted that during his visits, he experienced an overwhelming urge to leave the property as quickly as possible, a feeling of wrongness that had no rational explanation. He documented strange acoustic properties near the chapel, sounds seeming to echo in ways inconsistent with the building's size and structure. The sheriff also recorded his frustration with the limitations of his position. Without concrete evidence, without a body, without witnesses to an actual crime, he could not obtain a warrant to force entry into the chapel or conduct a thorough search of the property. His journal reveals a man torn between his duty to respect citizens' rights and his growing conviction that something deeply wrong was occurring at the Warren homestead. In September 1908, community anxiety about the Warren family reached a point where action seemed necessary. A meeting was called at the Galena Baptist Church, and church records indicate 37 residents attended. Reverend Matthews led the discussion, advocating strongly for some form of intervention regarding the Warren family. The disappearance of Samuel Briggs 6 months earlier and Preacher Reed the previous month weighed heavily on everyone's mind, and many felt that waiting for more evidence meant waiting for more people to vanish. Some community members defended the Warrens' right to privacy, arguing that strange behavior was not criminal behavior and that American principles of liberty meant people could live as they chose so long as they harmed no one. Others shared additional observations that had accumulated over the years. Several people reported strange odors carried on the wind from the Warren property, smells that were acrid and unpleasant but difficult to identify precisely. Children from multiple families reported experiencing nightmares after passing near the Warren homestead, dreams featuring pale figures and underground chambers that left them screaming themselves awake. Perhaps most disturbing, 3 families reported finding livestock dead near the property line with the Warren land, animals that showed no signs of disease or injury but had simply expired. No natural explanation could account for the pattern. The meeting resulted in the formation of an informal watch committee, groups of men who volunteered to monitor the Warren property from a distance on rotating schedules. Over the following weeks, they documented troubling observations. On multiple occasions, watchers reported seeing the entire Warren family emerge from their house after midnight and process in single file to the stone chapel, carrying lanterns that created an eerie procession through the darkness. The family would enter the chapel and remain inside for hours, sometimes until just before dawn. Sounds emanated from the structure, described by watchers as wailing that was not quite human, rhythmic but unsettling in its cadence. Most bizarrely, watchers on 3 separate occasions observed the Warren family standing in a circle in their yard, completely motionless, from dusk until dawn. They stood without moving, without speaking, apparently without even shifting their weight, for the entire night. When the sun rose, they would break the circle and return to their house as though nothing unusual had occurred. These observations were carefully documented and shared at subsequent community meetings, building a case that something was profoundly wrong at the Warren homestead, even if no one could yet articulate exactly what that something might be. On the 19th of October 1908, 8-year-old James Coleman wandered from his family's property while playing near the creek that formed the boundary between the Coleman land and the Warren homestead. When James failed to return for supper, his parents immediately organized a search, and within hours, over 50 community members were combing the area. The massive search effort continued through the night and into the next day, with men checking every hollow, every cave, every possible place a small boy might have gotten lost or injured. James's shoe was discovered on Warren property, approximately 100 yards from the stone chapel, a finding that immediately focused attention on the Warren family. Sheriff McKinley, accompanied by a dozen men, arrived at the Warren homestead demanding access to search the property. Silas Warren refused entry, citing his legal rights as a property owner and stating calmly that he had neither seen nor heard the boy. A tense standoff developed, with community members angry and frightened, demanding that the sheriff force entry, while McKinley tried to maintain legal procedure despite his own suspicions. Deputy Sheriff Frank Harrison documented the scene, in his official report describing the Warren family's reaction to the crowd of armed, angry men surrounding their property. The 6 family members stood in formation on their porch, father, mother, and 4 adult children, watching the crowd with expressions Harrison characterized as expectant, as if they were waiting for something to happen to the searchers, rather than concerned about a missing child. After 3 agonizing days, James Coleman was found alive but in a catatonic state, discovered in a root cellar on the Warren property by searchers who had finally been granted permission to conduct a thorough search. The boy was severely dehydrated, with visible marks on his wrists and ankles suggesting he had been physically restrained. But he bore no serious injuries. When confronted with James's presence on their property, the Warren family expressed what seemed like genuine confusion, claiming they had no knowledge of how the boy came to be in their root cellar and suggesting he must have hidden there on his own. Medical examination by Dr. Horace Williams revealed James' poor physical condition and profoundly disturbed mental state. The boy refused to speak, refused to eat, and exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma. His parents took him home, grateful to have him alive but deeply troubled by his condition and enraged at the Warrens' implausible claim of ignorance. The community's anger toward the Warren family reached a boiling point, with many calling for immediate action against them regardless of legal niceties. Dr. Horace Williams conducted a thorough medical examination of James Coleman, documenting his findings in a medical journal that would later be preserved in the Missouri State Archives. The boy showed signs of severe dehydration consistent with 3 days without adequate water, and his wrists and ankles bore marks indicating he had been bound with rope or cord, though no such restraints were found with him. Despite these physical indicators of mistreatment, James had no serious injuries, no broken bones, no wounds requiring suturing. His psychological state, however, was profoundly disturbed. For 5 days after his rescue, James remained completely mute, refusing to speak to anyone, including his parents. He would stare at walls for hours, occasionally whimpering but never forming words. Dr. Williams visited daily, attempting to coax the boy into communication, but James seemed locked in a private horror. On the 6th day, James finally began to speak, and his account, carefully documented by Dr. Williams, proved deeply disturbing. The boy claimed he had been approached near the creek by a pale woman who did not look quite right, whose face seemed wrong in ways he struggled to describe. This woman led him toward the Warren property, and though James knew he should not follow, he felt compelled to go with her. She took him to what he called the underground room, a space he described as cold and smelling of earth, and something sweet and rotten. In this room, James claimed to see people hanging from hooks on the ceiling like father hangs his deer after hunting. He stated that these hanging people were not moving at first, but that the Warren family came into the room and spoke to them in a language that hurt to hear, words that made his head ache and his stomach turn. After the Warren family spoke in this strange language, the hanging people started to move and reach for him with pale hands. Terrified, James fled, hiding in the root cellar, where he was eventually found. Dr. Williams included in his assessment a note of uncertainty. The boy's terror was genuine, he wrote, but children often confuse dreams with reality when traumatized. However, certain details James provided troubled the doctor. The boy described specific symbols he claimed to have seen carved into the walls of the underground room, geometric patterns that he drew with surprising precision. He also described the layout of spaces he should not have known about, including a stairway descending from the stone chapel, information that seemed too detailed to be pure fabrication. Dr. Williams concluded his report by stating that while he could not determine whether James had experienced actual events or trauma-induced hallucinations, the boy's distress was undeniably real. On the 28th of October 1908, Sheriff McKinley obtained a hastily drafted warrant and led a raid on the Warren property with 12 deputized men. The warrant, based on the discovery of James Coleman on the property and his subsequent disturbing testimony, authorized a complete search of all structures and grounds. The raid began at dawn, with the posse surrounding the property to prevent anyone from fleeing. The Warren family offered no resistance, simply standing together in their yard as the men approached. Multiple witnesses, including Sheriff McKinley and Deputy Harrison, documented what they discovered during the search. The main house proved relatively normal aside from its unusual coldness and a complete absence of food preparation areas. The kitchen contained no recent evidence of cooking, no food scraps, no dirty dishes, nothing to suggest meals had been prepared there for weeks or possibly months. Storage areas contained only preserved goods, jars of vegetables, smoked meats, dried fruits, all items that required no cooking. When questioned, Silas Warren explained that the family ate simply and had no need for elaborate meal preparation. The barn yielded more disturbing findings. While empty of animals as neighbors had reported, the floor and walls bore unusual grooves carved into the wood, patterns that seemed deliberate rather than the result of normal wear. These grooves formed symbols that several deputies found difficult to look at directly, shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. A strong chemical smell permeated the space, later identified as a mixture of lime and other preserving agents used typically for preventing decay in meat. The stone chapel presented the greatest challenge. The reinforced door resisted initial attempts to breach it, and nearly an hour passed before the deputies managed to force entry. When they finally broke through, what they discovered would change everything. The main room of the chapel bore little resemblance to any place of worship the men had seen. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with pages torn from books, hundreds of pages covered in handwritten text in multiple languages. A large table dominated the center of the room, and upon it lay strange instruments, including knives of unusual design, containers filled with various substances, and most disturbing, detailed anatomical drawings of human bodies marked with annotations in an unfamiliar alphabet. A second door, also reinforced, stood at the far end of the room. Behind this inner door, deputies discovered a descending staircase, carved carefully into the limestone, leading down into darkness. Several men volunteered to explore, and what they found in the natural cave system below would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cave system beneath the Warren Stone Chapel had been extensively modified from its natural state, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages that showed evidence of deliberate widening and smoothing. Sheriff McKinley's official report, submitted to the county prosecutor, provided a clinical description of what the raiding party discovered, though witnesses later admitted that the written account failed to capture the full horror of the scene. In the largest chamber, approximately 30 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to 15 feet at its highest point, they found human remains. McKinley's report stated there was evidence of at least 7 distinct individuals, though complete identification proved difficult due to the condition of the remains. The bodies showed signs of intentional preservation, using methods that suggested sophisticated knowledge of anatomy and chemistry. Most disturbing was the arrangement of the remains in a specific pattern, positioned in a circle around a central space that remained empty. The bodies were not simply discarded or hidden, but had been placed with deliberate care, suggesting ritualistic purpose. McKinley noted that he could not determine from the condition of the remains whether death had occurred in the cave or whether bodies had been brought there post-mortem. The cave walls bore more of the strange symbols found in the chapel above, carved deep into the limestone with tools that must have required considerable time and effort. These symbols seemed to follow patterns, repeating certain shapes while varying others, suggesting some form of language or notation system. Several deputies reported feeling intensely uncomfortable in the cave, experiencing headaches, nausea, and an overwhelming urge to flee. The air itself seemed wrong, colder than natural cave temperature and carrying an odor that combined decay with something acrid and chemical. Evidence collected from the scene included bones showing tool marks consistent with butchering, containers of preserving agents, more of the unusual knives found in the chapel above, and fabric remnants that appeared to be clothing from different individuals. McKinley ordered everything carefully documented and removed for further examination. The discovery of human remains transformed the Warren case from mysterious disappearances to confirmed homicide. The methodical nature of what had been done in the cave, the obvious planning and purpose behind the arrangement of bodies, indicated this was not the result of sudden violence or passion, but something far more calculated. As the raiding party emerged from the cave system, carrying evidence of unthinkable crimes, the Warren family remained standing silently in their yard, showing no emotion offering no explanation, simply waiting with that same expectant expression witnesses had noted before. The arrest of all 6 Warren family members proceeded without incident. They offered no resistance, made no attempt to flee, and remained eerily calm as they were placed in restraints and loaded into wagons for transport to the Stone County Jail. During the entire process, Silas Warren spoke only once, stating in a clear, controlled voice that the deputies had interrupted a work that had been in progress for generations and that they could not comprehend what they had interfered with. This cryptic statement would be the only explanation the family patriarch would provide. Evidence removed from the Warren property filled several wagons and required days to catalog properly. Investigators found journals written in elaborate code, requiring expert analysis to decipher, religious texts of no known denomination, printed in languages that Professor Hartley from the University of Missouri later identified as mixtures of archaic Welsh, Latin, and symbols not associated with any documented language system. Correspondence with contacts in Massachusetts and New York suggested the Warren family maintained connections with others who shared their beliefs, whatever those beliefs might be. Detailed records of astronomical events and their perceived significance indicated the family timed their activities according to celestial alignments. Most damning was a ledger containing names, dates, and brief notations. Some names matched missing persons from across several states dating back 15 years, suggesting the Warren family's activities extended far beyond the 2 disappearances that had brought them to official attention. Individual interrogations revealed the different personalities within the family while providing little useful information. Silas refused to answer any questions, sitting in complete silence with his eyes fixed on the wall of his cell. Constance spoke only once, repeating the phrase, "The door must be kept open," before lapsing back into silence. Nathaniel provided elaborate explanations involving maintaining the boundary and serving the threshold, speaking in abstract terms that seemed simultaneously purposeful and meaningless. Abigail remained completely mute throughout all questioning, staring at her interrogators without blinking for uncomfortable lengths of time. Jeremiah laughed inappropriately during questioning, making disturbing comments about crossing over and joining the waiting ones, statements that seemed designed to unsettle rather than inform. Only Ruth showed what might be interpreted as distress, begging repeatedly to be allowed to complete the work, though she would not explain what this work entailed. Sheriff McKinley and the county prosecutor agreed that the family's behavior suggested either shared delusion or a level of commitment to their beliefs that transcended normal self-preservation instinct. The question of whether they were insane or simply evil would become central to the coming trial. Dr. Horace Williams faced an unprecedented challenge in conducting forensic examination of the remains discovered in the Warren cave system. Working with primitive equipment by modern standards, but utilizing the most advanced techniques available in rural Missouri in 1908, Williams painstakingly examined each set of remains, documenting his findings with meticulous care. His report identified 7 distinct individuals based on skeletal analysis and the presence of personal effects. 3 were positively identified through items found with the remains and comparisons with missing persons reports. Samuel Briggs, whose disappearance in March had initiated community suspicion of the Warrens, was identified through distinctive dental work and a pocket watch his father confirmed belonged to his son. Preacher Amos Reed was identified through his clerical collar and a silver cross he habitually wore, items his widow confirmed. A traveling merchant named Harold Peterson, reported missing while passing through the area in 1907, was identified through business papers found in his clothing and unique boot modifications he required due to a clubfoot. The 4 other sets of remains proved more difficult to identify definitively, though Williams estimated they had been in the cave system for varying lengths of time, ranging from several months to possibly several years. The condition of all remains indicated they had been subjected to preservation techniques before being arranged in the cave. Williams noted evidence of sophisticated anatomical knowledge in how bodies had been processed. The most troubling aspect of Williams' examination was his observation that the remains had been positioned with deliberate care in a circular pattern around a central, empty space. The preservation methods used, involving combinations of lime, salt, and other chemical agents, showed knowledge that went beyond simple prevention of decay. Several bodies exhibited evidence of post-mortem manipulation, with bones repositioned in ways that would have required careful dissection, cavities filled with unknown substances that Williams could not immediately identify, and in 2 cases, organs that appeared to have been removed and replaced with what seemed to be combinations of natural materials, including specific types of wood, certain stones, and preserved plant matter. Williams included in his report a section on what he termed ritual indicators, evidence suggesting the bodies had been treated according to some systematic methodology rather than randomly disposed of. He noted the precision of cuts, the careful arrangement of remains, the placement of specific objects within body cavities, all pointing toward actions taken for purpose beyond simple murder and concealment. His professional opinion was that whoever had prepared these bodies possessed both anatomical expertise and adherence to a complex system of beliefs that dictated specific post-mortem treatment. Professor Edmund Hartley of the University of Missouri spent 3 months analyzing the journals, correspondence, and documents seized from the Warren property. His report to the Stone County prosecutor provided the first comprehensive understanding of the belief system that had motivated the Warren family's horrific actions. According to Hartley's translation and interpretation of the family's extensive writings, the Warrens believed themselves to be hereditary threshold keepers, individuals born into a sacred duty spanning generations. Their journals described a cosmology in which the physical world existed alongside what they called the other place, a realm of entities that sought entry into our reality. The Warrens claimed their family lineage had maintained barriers between these worlds for centuries, always seeking locations with specific characteristics, including limestone cave systems, natural springs, and particular astronomical alignments. The family believed that regular rituals and human sacrifice were necessary to strengthen the door between worlds and prevent what they termed the seeping, a gradual intrusion of the other place into physical reality. Their writings described in disturbing detail how they selected victims, always choosing travelers, people whose disappearance would not immediately raise alarm in any single location. Individuals, they believed, would serve the greater purpose of protecting humanity from incomprehensible horrors. The journals contained detailed accounts of rituals performed in the cave system, ceremonies timed to celestial events including equinoxes, solstices, and particular planetary alignments. Most chilling were references throughout the documents to communication with the Waiting Ones, entities the Warrens claimed resided just beyond the barrier they maintained. These entities apparently provided instructions for rituals, guidance on selecting appropriate victims, and warnings about weakening of the threshold. The Warrens wrote of hearing voices during their ceremonies, of receiving visions showing them what would happen if they failed in their duty, terrible images of reality tearing apart as the other place flooded through. Hartley noted that the belief system, while clearly delusional from a rational perspective, exhibited internal consistency and appeared to be genuinely held by all family members. This was not improvised madness but inherited conviction, a worldview passed from generation to generation with the certainty of religious truth. The correspondence with contacts in Massachusetts and New York suggested others shared similar beliefs, possibly other families maintaining their own thresholds in different locations. One letter, from someone signing only as the Boston Keeper, referenced 7 gates maintained across the country, suggesting an organized network of believers engaged in similar activities. Hartley concluded his report by noting that understanding the Warrens' beliefs did not excuse their actions, but might help explain how rational-appearing people could commit such horrors, convinced they were protecting rather than harming. The trial of the Warren family began in November 1908 and extended through March 1909, drawing extensive coverage from regional newspapers and becoming one of the most sensational criminal cases in Missouri history. The prosecutor built his case methodically, presenting physical evidence from the cave system, testimony from Dr. Williams regarding the remains, analysis from Professor Hartley explaining the family's belief system, and testimony from James Coleman, the only known survivor of contact with the Warren rituals. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. The defense, appointed by the court as the Warren family had no resources to hire their own counsel, faced an impossible task. Their strategy centered on arguing shared delusional disorder, attempting to prove the family suffered from mental illness rather than criminal intent. They presented expert testimony from an alienist who explained how entire families could become trapped in shared psychosis, particularly when isolated from broader society. The defense argued that the religious nature of the Warrens' beliefs should afford some degree of protection, that sincere religious conviction, however misguided, indicated lack of criminal mens rea. Most challenging for the prosecution was proving definitively that the Warrens had actually killed the individuals whose remains were found rather than merely desecrated bodies obtained through other means. Without witnesses to actual murders and with limited forensic capabilities, establishing cause of death proved difficult for several victims. The trial might have resulted in lesser convictions had Nathaniel Warren not broken his family's silence during the defense phase. Against his attorney's advice and over the objections of his father, Nathaniel insisted on testifying. For 3 hours, he provided explicit, detailed testimony about the rituals, the killings, and the family's systematic approach to what they considered their sacred duty. His testimony, preserved in court records, included disturbing descriptions of how victims were chosen, how they were lured or captured, often with the women of the family acting as bait, and how they were killed in specific ritualistic manners designed to properly prepare them for their role in maintaining the threshold. Nathaniel showed no remorse during his testimony, instead expressing frustration that the work would now be left incomplete, that the threshold would go unwatched. His testimony sealed the fate of all 6 family members. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts for all defendants on multiple counts of first-degree murder. Judge William Harrison sentenced all 6 to death by hanging, the maximum penalty available under Missouri law. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions, some expressing satisfaction that justice had been served, others troubled by the execution of what they saw as mentally ill individuals. The Warren family members showed no emotion as sentence was pronounced, standing together silently as they had throughout the trial. Between their conviction in March 1909 and scheduled execution in July, the Warren family remained in Stone County Jail, with each member held in separate cells to prevent coordination. Despite this separation, guards documented increasingly strange occurrences that defied rational explanation. Multiple guards on different shifts reported hearing rhythmic chanting emanating from all 6 cells simultaneously, despite the prisoners being unable to see or hear each other, voices rising and falling in perfect synchronization, using words in unknown languages. Temperature fluctuations occurred around the Warren family members' cells, with some areas becoming inexplicably cold even during the warm spring months, cold enough that guards could see their breath despite temperatures elsewhere in the jail remaining normal. Light bulbs, newly installed in the jail as part of modernization efforts, consistently failed in the corridor near the Warren cells, requiring replacement weekly, while bulbs elsewhere functioned normally. Several guards submitted reports describing shadows that moved against light sources, dark shapes that seemed to flow along walls and ceilings near the Warren cells, shapes that disappeared when directly observed, but returned when attention shifted. One guard, Michael O'Brien, submitted his resignation after claiming he saw figures standing in the corners of the cells, tall, pale forms that vanished when he turned his head but reappeared in peripheral vision. O'Brien refused to work another shift, stating he had a wife and children to consider and would not risk his sanity for any wage. Dr. Williams continued observing the family members throughout their incarceration, noting their declining physical condition as they ate minimally and slept rarely, yet paradoxically, they maintained energized mental states. All 6 insisted repeatedly that they must be allowed to complete one final ritual before execution, that leaving the work unfinished would have consequences the authorities could not comprehend. These requests were denied, though Sheriff McKinley privately admitted in his journal that the family's certainty troubled him in ways he could not articulate. 1 week before the scheduled execution, Silas Warren requested a meeting with Sheriff McKinley, breaking his months-long silence. In McKinley's office, Silas spoke calmly and deliberately, making what he termed not a threat, but a warning. He explained that 7 gates were maintained across the country by 7 families dedicated to keeping the barrier intact. The Warren family had held one of these gates, and by ending their line, the authorities were weakening the entire system. "What we kept out will find its way in," Silas stated, slowly, perhaps, but inevitably. The sheriff recorded this conversation in his journal, noting that Silas spoke with absolute conviction and showed no fear of his impending death. The 12th of July, 1909, dawned clear and hot, the kind of oppressive summer day common in Missouri, where humidity makes the air feel thick and breathing requires effort. The execution of all 6 Warren family members was scheduled for dawn, but a crowd had gathered during the night, some seeking justice for the victims, others drawn by morbid curiosity to witness the end of Missouri's most notorious family. Multiple witnesses documented the events of that morning, and their accounts, while consistent in basic facts, differed in disturbing details that would be debated for decades. The Warrens were brought to the scaffold one by one, father first, followed by mother, then the children in order of age. Throughout the process, they maintained complete composure, showing neither fear nor remorse. They continued speaking to each other in what Professor Hartley identified as a mixture of archaic Welsh and unknown language elements, their voices calm and measured despite the circumstances. When all 6 stood on the scaffold with nooses in place, they made one final synchronized statement before the hoods were placed over their heads. "The door stands unwatched," they said in perfect unison. "The threshold weakens." Dr. Williams supervised the execution in his capacity as county physician, confirming deaths after the prescribed time. His medical report noted peculiar observations that troubled him professionally. All 6 bodies exhibited unusual rigor mortis patterns, with muscles contracting in ways not typical of hanging victims, almost as though they had tensed deliberately rather than experiencing the involuntary muscle response normally associated with strangulation. Most strange, when the hoods were removed for official confirmation of death, all 6 appeared to be smiling, expressions that the mechanism of death should not have produced. Williams could offer no medical explanation for this phenomenon. The bodies were taken down and transported to the Potter's Field for burial in unmarked graves, as no family had claimed them, and no one wanted them interred in consecrated ground. The hangings drew the Warren case to its legal conclusion, but witnesses would debate for years whether justice had been served or whether something else had occurred on that scaffold. That night, as darkness fell over Stone County, strange events began unfolding. Residents within 5 miles of the former Warren property reported unusual phenomena starting around midnight. Multiple families described unexplained sounds, not natural night noises but rhythmic tones that seemed to come from beneath the ground. Those few homes with electricity experienced simultaneous disturbances, lights flickering in patterns, bulbs exploding without apparent cause. Animals behaved strangely. Dogs howling in unison, horses refusing to enter their barns, cattle breaking through fences in apparent panic. The aftermath of the Warren executions extended far beyond July 1909, with consequences that would unfold over more than a century. The Warren property became immediate pariah land that the county found impossible to sell despite multiple attempts and drastically reduced prices. Local residents avoided the area, and the few who attempted to purchase the land for development quickly abandoned their plans after experiencing what they uniformly described as overwhelming unease. The buildings were dismantled in 1912, with workers reporting unusual difficulties including tools mysteriously going missing, inexplicable accidents, and several laborers refusing to continue after experiencing what they termed oppressive atmospheres that made breathing difficult and thinking unclear. The stone chapel proved extremely difficult to demolish, with its thick walls and deep foundation resisting conventional methods. Eventually, the cave entrance beneath was sealed with concrete, and the land was left abandoned, gradually returning to wilderness. For decades following the executions, residents near the former Warren property reported ongoing unusual experiences. Strange sounds continued, particularly on nights corresponding to dates the Warrens had marked as significant in their astronomical records. Sounds described as rhythmic chanting or wailing that seemed to emanate from beneath the earth where the sealed cave system lay. Apparitions were reported with remarkable consistency, pale figures seen among the trees at dusk that would vanish when approached. Multiple witnesses described experiencing profound and irrational dread when passing near the property, a fear so intense it compelled them to flee despite having no logical reason for such terror. The area gained local reputation as cursed, with parents warning children to avoid Preacher's Gap and travelers taking longer routes to circumvent the region. In 1957, during renovation of the Stone County Courthouse, workers discovered Sheriff McKinley's complete personal journals behind a false wall in what had been his office. These journals revealed details McKinley had never included in official reports, private admissions that during his investigations of the Warren property, he had witnessed events he could not rationally explain, but dared not report for fear of being considered mentally unsound. McKinley wrote of seeing shadows move independently of light sources, of hearing voices whispering in languages he did not recognize, of experiencing moments where time seemed to slow or skip forward inexplicably. Most troubling, McKinley admitted that after the executions, he sometimes wondered whether the Warrens had been entirely delusional or whether they had perceived something real that others could not see, whether their horrific actions had been motivated by genuine belief in a threat they alone understood. These private doubts haunted McKinley until his death in 1923, doubts he shared with no one but his journal. In 1973, a geological survey team investigating cave systems in Stone County as part of a broader study of Ozark limestone formations, located and examined the sealed Warren Cave despite concrete barriers that should have been impenetrable. Their official report, obtained decades later through Freedom of Information requests, described unusual features that raised questions the team was not equipped to answer. The cave system extended far deeper than the Warren family could have excavated with available tools and time, suggesting they had discovered and modified a pre-existing structure rather than creating it entirely themselves. Rock formations within the cave showed evidence of intentional carving and arrangement, patterns that seemed too regular to be natural but too ancient to have been created by the Warrens. Most puzzling were the acoustic properties of the space. The cave produced unusual echoes and resonances, sounds reflecting and amplifying in ways that created almost musical tones, patterns that could, under the right conditions, resemble voices or chanting without any human source being present. The survey team noted disorientation and unease while working in the cave, with several members requesting to leave before the examination was complete. In 1989, Professor Sarah Mitchell from Missouri State University led an archaeological investigation of the former Warren homestead site, seeking to document what remained of this significant historical location. Her team's excavation revealed artifacts buried around where the stone chapel had stood, items consistent with ritualistic use, but dating back centuries before the Warren family's occupation. These discoveries suggested the site might have been used for similar purposes long before the Warrens arrived, that perhaps they had chosen the location because of its history rather than randomly selecting it. Mitchell's work also uncovered evidence of earlier structures beneath the Warren buildings, foundations and post holes, indicating human activity predating any documented settlement. Contemporary connections to the Warren case continue accumulating. Documentation shows Stone County has experienced higher than average reports of missing persons between 1,909 and present day, a statistical anomaly that might be coincidental, but has attracted attention from researchers studying geographical patterns in disappearances. Recurring accounts of strange phenomena in the area persist into the modern era, with hikers, hunters, and residents reporting experiences similar to those documented in 1908 and 1909. Several documented cases exist of individuals experiencing shared hallucinations or delusions after spending time near the former Warren property. People with no prior mental health issues suddenly experiencing visions or hearing voices, symptoms that typically resolve after leaving the area, but occasionally persist long-term. What really happened in Preacher's Gap remains subject to interpretation more than a century later. Were the Warrens simply a family consumed by shared madness, their minds trapped in elaborate delusions that led them to commit horrific murders they justified through invented religious beliefs? Or did they genuinely perceive something others could not see, a threat they understood in ways that drove them to desperate measures society could only interpret as evil? The documentation leaves us with disturbing questions that resist simple answers. The fact remains undeniable that 7 people died at the Warren property, Their lives ended through violence, and their bodies subjected to ritualistic treatment that suggested purpose beyond mere murder. Whether they were victims of a delusional family's madness or participants in something darker, something that touched genuine mysteries our rational minds refuse to acknowledge, we may never fully know. The land where the Warren homestead stood remains vacant today, more than a century after the family's execution. Despite the passage of time, despite modern developments spreading throughout Stone County, that particular plot has resisted all attempts at use. Developers who purchased the land abandoned their plans after preliminary work. Attempts to build have consistently failed, with construction accidents, equipment malfunctions, and workers refusing to continue, citing feelings they cannot articulate but cannot ignore. Local residents still avoid the area after dark, taking longer routes rather than pass through Preacher's Gap when night falls. Occasionally, particularly on the anniversary of the Warren family's execution, each July 12th, reports surface of sounds in the woods, rhythmic chanting or wailing that seems to come from beneath the ground where the sealed cave lies buried. Those who hear these sounds describe them as disturbing, not because they are loud or threatening, but because they feel wrong. Sounds that create instinctive revulsion, primal fear that bypasses rational thought. Some dismiss these reports as imagination, suggesting that wind through the limestone formations creates acoustic effects that resemble human voices, that knowledge of the area's history predisposes people to interpret natural sounds as supernatural. Others, particularly those who know the full story of the Warren family, are not so certain. They remember Silas Warren's final warning about the unwatched door and the weakening threshold. They note the pattern of continuing disappearances and unexplained phenomena. They wonder whether the Warrens, for all their terrible actions, might have been protecting something rather than threatening it, whether their execution removed a barrier we did not understand until it was too late. The truth, like the Warren cave system itself, remains sealed beneath layers of time and earth and uncertainty, accessible only to those willing to descend into darkness. And what they might find there, none can say with certainty.